Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the deep, dark world of Pokemon. Now, I tried filming this video a couple days ago, and it corrupted and did not upload, so it has to be refilmed. But while filming it, I'd come up with another theory about Pokemon, which I've had a little bit more time to research, thanks to the corrupted video. So let's talk about the economics of the Pokemon world, leading into the potential problems with their politics in general. Now, the way that this started off was a friend asked me a question about poor people in Pokemon, and we were going over potential reasons why there really didn't seem to be any. Now, for one thing, basically everyone's needs are taken care of by the Pokemon. We'll touch back on this later, because they definitely do have a monetary system with some degree of capitalism, even if what their actual political structure is somewhat uncertain, despite there being lots of footage to go through. It would seem to be suggested they might be ruled by the strongest Pokemon leaders, the gym leaders in the Elite Four in some senses, but anyway, they definitely have a monetary system. And this brought us around to the question of Meowth, and the term I'm going to coin as Meowth inflation. See, Meowth raises a huge problem in any economic system it's included in, given that it produces coins which are viable currency. Now, anyone who's ever looked up the why don't we just print more money argument knows the problem with inflation and with just creating currency. The more of it you have, the more it devalues the standard. So in other words, the more coins that get created by a Meowth, the less the coins are worth. This explains why children are picking up thousands of dollars on the side of the street and bicycles cost $1 million. It's because, among other reasons, Meowth, I would assume, and Persian, given that it would have the same skill abilities, have completely not destroyed the economy, but caused rapid inflation. Now, normally speaking, when we see places with this level of rapid inflation, it comes after some sort of socialist expansion. There's several tenets within socialism that tend to cause inflation. Inflation isn't necessarily the end of the world for an economy if handled properly, but given that you have to carry these coins, they're not even paper bills, inflation would seem to be a fairly big issue for members of the Pokemon world eventually. And this brings us to the next question. Why doesn't everyone just have a Meowth? Well, there aren't really too many poor or impoverished people in Pokemon. In one or two games, you can run into one or two people with mentions that they have nowhere to go, but this might be more because of social stigma than anything else. And we have Jessie from Jessie and James Team Rocket, who mentions that she's from a poor family in a poor area, but poor may just be a relative term, and Jessie may just be one of the few people smart enough to see that. See, anyone who was actually homeless or poor on the streets would start looking for ways to improve their lot in life, and would fairly rapidly realize that Meowths are common, and that you can grab a cat that prints currency free on most street corners in any major city, from the way that they're portrayed in both the show and in the games. As as such, if a ruling higher class wanted to, say, use the system for themselves and print Meowth money, making themselves excessively wealthy and taking all of the, true higher things in life, while keeping the general population away from the idea of using Meowths to print currency, well, they'd have to keep the general population happy and distracted. So, if you can achieve a basic standard of living where most people are generally content with their lot in life, a lot of people won't necessarily try to improve. Oh, some people will. There are definitely the, ambitious out there. But for the most part, people will just go along in life if things are going well. So if you can achieve a general standard of living for basically everyone that ensures there are little to no poor people, as we see in Pokemon, then you can start basically socially engineering ways to keep the general populace away from certain ideas that are right in front of them, like printing cat currency. So, what about those ambitious few? And not necessarily even few, but what about the ambitious people who are going to want to improve themselves? They're going to want more than that in life. Well, that's where Pokemon training, trading, and battling comes in. From a very, very early age, children are encouraged, for, I believe, a number of reasons, to go out and train and battle Pokemon. This gives the adventurous who want to improve themselves in life a way to continuously improve that has nothing to do with rising in their economic status or, in their luxury in life, and everything to do with Pokemon. Battling and trading. It's essentially a distraction that most of the people in upper society don't bother with. And the next time you go watch the series, keep an eye on how many of them have Persians, because I think I'm onto something here, and it's not just Giovanni, potentially the richest person we've seen in the Pokemon universe, who's walking around with one. A lot of the more ambitious youth also end up in Team Rocket for one reason or another, especially because of how their recruiting works. What little of it we've seen, at least, definitely seems to target the disenfranchised and ambitious youth. So, all of a sudden we have a system where most people's needs are met, where the ambitious who want to rise in life have plenty of very distracting, flashy ways to do so that have basically nothing to do with rising economically, and we have a few upper crust, high-class citizens who seem to have a lot of power, but very little public appearance. Anyway, the more that I poked through, and I'm mostly familiar with the original series, but from what I've seen, this trend continues, the more interesting it got. You start counting bedrooms and bathrooms in any of the towns in the show or the games, and then count the number of people, and it'll seem like it should be nightmarish, but everything is kept so clean and lively that, people seem to be happy. So how could this be possible? And if it were somehow possible in the world of Pokemon, is there any way to replicate it in our world? I mean, their economy isn't structured nearly as complexly as ours, so it probably wouldn't correlate. But since the inflation issue actually started making a little bit of sense when I looked into Meowths and the numbers that they work with in the games, I looked a step further and took a step back from economics to look at things politically and try and see how all of this might be possible. The answer is right there in front of you. It's the Pokemon. Now, Pokemon are a subjugated slave underclass who use their special abilities to make the easy life possible for us peoples. Let me explain. A lot of people think of Pokemon kind of like pets or workhorses when it comes to them doing the day-to-day work for most people, because the more you watch Pokemon, the more social services and basic everyday needs are taken care of by Pokemon for people, to a point that can get Flintstonian at times, as people are, say, drifting through the air holding on to Pokemon balloons and using them to fly. Not even ones that they've captured and are training, just random ones floating by. Well, not random, but anyway. So, Pokemon are treated much the same way as animals that we, used to plow fields in the past and everything else to make our life easier. Pokemon are just much more versatile and varied, so they can fill a lot more purposes, making life a lot easier, right? Well, kind of. The problem is that Pokemon are far more intelligent than animals. You first look at the example of Meowth from Team Rocket, who is one of the easiest to point to because, well, he can talk. And so he can express his intelligence, and, in my opinion, isn't the stupidest member of that trio, containing 2 people. So there's definitely something to be argued for Pokemon having human-level intelligence. And yes, Pokemon get stronger when they have a trainer, but we've seen Pokemon, including Meowth in some of his flashbacks, be able to express this level of intelligence and even speak before they had trainers. In fact, Meowth learned to speak to impress another pretty Meowth, as I recall. So what about the ones who can't talk? Well, look at Pikachu. Pikachu and Ash are quite frequently seen basically discussing strategy. We just only hear Ash's side. Now, Ash is, the type of awestruck teenager who very frequently feels the need to vocalize his anything that surprises him. So when Pikachu comes up with a good idea, Ash will, of course, share it with the audience. It's a really useful storytelling tool, but it also gives us insight into Pikachu's level of intelligence, which, as far as we can tell, seems to be on par with, or potentially a bit above, that of its trainer. Ash is just the only one who can understand Pikachu. Well, unless the theory that the Pikachu in Detective Pikachu is Ash's Pikachu, in which case Ash and that guy. Anyway, Detective Pikachu is something I'll get into in a minute, because it plays kind of an important role in the slave race theory. It both confirms it as well as showing a path out, but I haven't actually seen it yet. I've just been reading up on it. Anyway, though, Pokemon being a subjugated slave race is, something that I think we've all basically known, but people don't generally think of Pokemon as intelligent. And a lot of them aren't. Pokemon also get stronger when they're paired with a trainer. So while we've definitely seen signs of intelligence from Pokemon in the wild, it is possible that the stronger a Pokemon gets, the more intelligent it gets, and that having a trainer could even help Pokemon achieve a degree of sentience. So, okay, if we're that important for Pokemon's development, they need us, right? Why can't we use them? Well, we can and certainly do. But there's the question of, is it morally right? And, oh yes, now I'm talking about the morals of Pokemon, but B, the question of, is it sustainable? See, there's a pattern we've seen throughout history anytime there's been oppression. And it's funny, I was quoting this I was saying this the first time I filmed this video, almost word for word, and then recently saw a British member of Parliament say almost the same thing, but about something much sillier. Anyway, well, I guess much less silly in some ways. But in history, we've seen when there is an oppressed underclass, they tend to rise up. They tend to eventually start fighting that oppression and doing what they can to break free of it. And Pokemon are likely no different, especially from what we've seen of Mewtwo and several others who definitely seem to have less than positive views of humans at times. Now, sure, from what we see in the Pokemon world, most people are friends with their Pokemon and work hand in hand with them, but there aren't really laws protecting their rights. Something which was always kind of easy to assume, but is made clear in Detective Pikachu, where that city is the exception to the rule. That is the city where people are working hand in hand with Pokemon as partners and equals, rather than treating them as pets and attack dogs, essentially. So this brings us to another big Pokemon theory that has gone on for some time. Was there just a big war before Pokemon Red and Blue? Well, we know there was a war, at least within Lieutenant Surge's lifetime, and he's not the only one to speak of it. So there's certainly been some sort of conflict, and people have mused at length about what that conflict looked like. The main problem being, who was the opponent? Was it a civil war? If so, why aren't there, remnants of both sides like there were after basically any other civil war in history? And if not, who was the nation they were fighting? Was it the Johto and the Kanto region fighting each other? Again, wouldn't there have been records of that? Well, what if it was a Pokemon revolution? This is the idea that I had while actually filming the last video, and have now had just a little bit more time to look into. What if the Pokemon revolted, tired of being an oppressed underclass of slaves? And let's face it, a Charizard could roast a village full of humans fairly easily. However, as we know, Pokemon paired with trainers are stronger than their counterparts in the wild. So, Pokemon and their trainers would be potentially capable, working together in the right numbers and with the right strategies, of putting down a revolt of wild Pokemon, of putting Pokemon back in their place. Now, say Pokemon's sentience, as it very much seems to be if you watch the series closely, is tied to their level of power. Perhaps Pokemon in the wild, and even ones who are just used, around the town to make life easier, had gotten stronger and stronger, and people hadn't worried about it, even ones that weren't linked with trainers. And eventually a number of these powerful unlinked Pokemon, formed together, spoke with their brethren, and rallied the ranks. If trainers like Lieutenant Surge had fought in a war where they had used their trained Pokemon to put down the most powerful of the wild Pokemon and spread those who were not powerful enough to have achieved sentience back out into the wild, it would probably be a bad idea to keep a history of it, as any Pokemon reaching the point of sentience would then revolt almost immediately, knowing the history of slaughter among the strongest of their kind. Now, this is, of course, just a theory. However, it does tie together a lot of things in the Pokemon universe, and it does fill a lot of the holes in the other war theories. I mean, all of a sudden we have an opponent, and one that it makes sense that they wouldn't keep records of once the war was over. One who would have been a viable threat, enough of one that Lieutenant Surge would need his Pokemon to save his life. But one which, once put down, would spread back out to the wilds, not to be heard of until the next group of powerful Pokemon popped up. And all of a sudden, after the war, well, and maybe before, but we know after the war, children are encouraged to go out and catch Pokemon, especially the strongest that they can find. And so the strongest Pokemon are, in higher and higher numbers, bound with and subject to people. Now, I've for a long time thought that the fact that children are allowed to go out and catch Pokemon was an early recruitment program for the war. We know Pokemon were used in the war, or for the army, I should say. We know Pokemon were used in the war, and I feel that if there was ever another conflict, they would want their region to be as best prepared as possible. It's almost like arguing to teach your children how to use guns. In a sense, a similar argument. Except in this case, Pokemon are far, far more necessary and integrated into every part of the world and society than guns are for us. And I didn't really mean to get into the gun thing, it just popped into my head. Anyway, so it would make sense that they would want children to get to know how to control and use Pokemon, as almost no matter what lot in life you're going into, you're going to be dealing with these creatures, and it will help to have that knowledge and usually a couple Pokeballs on hand. But if we'd recently fought a revolution against the strongest of the wild Pokemon and their brethren, and had to put down or capture them, because that is an interesting thought. Could we capture these and have them actually eventually be subjugated enough to work with us? Or would they have simply put down the strong and sentient ones and started subjugating those under them? I think the latter, but have to go back through and see if there's an argument for the former. Anyway, it would make sense to have everyone, children and anyone possible, go out and start catching the strongest Pokemon they could. Building industries around it and basing your government off of it all of a sudden makes a lot more sense when that's what's preventing the revolution from coming. And there might still be one in the future, as the more technological communication spreads across the world, the easier it is for people who are oppressed to share their stories of oppression and to rise up together. This would be the same in the Pokemon universe, and it would be the same for any sentient Pokemon that did manage to evade the Pokeballs. So Pokemon may very well have another war on its hands in the future. One that's being held in check as much as anything else by the efforts of children. And it might seem, looking through the history of the world, like this is inevitable. Like the revolution will come, as the Marxists like to say. But while I haven't actually seen the movie yet, I've watched quite a bit of footage of the game now and poked through the lore. And I do have to say that Detective Pikachu offers us another way out. Detective Pikachu shows a city where Pokemon and people are working together in harmony, as it should be. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't form the bonds that a trainer does that help the Pokemon become stronger and help the trainer move forward in life. But it doesn't necessarily have to be as trainer and, subject. It could just be as friends and partners. We've seen that basically the gods of the Pokemon universe are Pokemon, who've created everything, or alien Pokemon gods. It's complicated. But basically, Pokemon are the creators, in a sense, a few of them. And it's very, very possible that they wanted to create a world that could be perfect, but in which free will also existed. See, if people and Pokemon work together, as we've seen, they're very, very close to a utopia with Pokemon as a subjugated slave race and all of the problems that entails. If they were actually working perfectly in harmony with each other, sure, you might have a problem of a smart, rich few controlling the masses and taking the biggest laps of luxury for themselves. You might still have Meowth inflation and a currency that would eventually have to be completely redone. But ultimately speaking, you would have solutions to all of life's everyday problems. Everything would be basically perfect. And eventually, if the Pokemon, worked in tangent with humans enough that enough of them gained sentience and became more useful to us than just a subjugated slave race, I think that those at the top would have little reason to keep luxuries for themselves, as luxuries spread to the masses in the way that a true utopia begins. So, there's certainly dangers ahead for the Pokemon universe. They're sitting in a social and economic setting where inflation could cause an economic collapse if they don't have more and more Pokemon to rely on, and the Pokemon could rise up and revolt at any day, as they have really every right to do so from the way that they've been treated, especially given that they are literally the gods, at least some of them. So, there's definitely a dark path ahead, but there's a bright path as well. And, well, it has